The house was eerily silent when we arrived at the charming Airbnb in Iowa. My family was away for my younger brother's graduation, and I was left to prepare a surprise party. The house had a quaint, almost too perfect exterior, but it carried an unsettling atmosphere inside. My other brother and I decided to grab an extra table from the basement to set up for the party. As soon as we entered the basement, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the cold, but a creeping sense of dread that clung to the air. The cellar was dimly lit, with old wooden beams and a musty smell that seemed to seep from the walls. The faint hum of the furnace only added to the unease. We found the table quickly, but something about that moment made me uneasy. It was as if the shadows in the room's corners were watching us. We hurried back upstairs, trying to shake off the feeling. My brother laughed it off, but I couldn't ignore the knot of fear that tightened in my stomach. The party itself went off without a hitch. Laughter and music filled the house, drowning out lingering thoughts about the basement. But strange things began to happen once the guests left and the house fell into a quiet that seemed too heavy. I was in the kitchen with my girlfriend when we heard a faint clunking sound from the laundry room. I went to check, and to my surprise, the washing machine was making noises as if it was running, even though it hadn't been used. I turned it off, shaking my head at how eerie it felt. Later, we heard a whirring noise from the living room. The old ceiling fan had turned on by itself, spinning at full speed despite our having turned it off earlier. The blades cut through the air with an unnerving squeal. I tried to laugh it off, blaming it on faulty wiring, but my girlfriend's worried eyes told me she wasn't buying it. That night, as we lay in bed, the house creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. Every little sound made me jump. Then, we heard a noise, a scraping sound, coming from the kitchen. We exchanged nervous glances before I got up to investigate. As I approached the kitchen, the smell of must and decay hit me, stronger than before. The fan was still whirling away, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we weren't alone. I wanted to check everything and ensure we were safe, but a cold sweat made moving hard. I decided to stay up for a while, hoping that whatever was causing the disturbances would reveal itself. My thoughts raced, and I tried to rationalize what we'd experienced, but deep down, I knew something more sinister was at play. The night went on, and despite the party being a blast, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over me. After the guests left, my girlfriend Lisa and I cleaned up. As we worked, I noticed the old house seemed quieter than usual. It was the kind of calm that almost seemed oppressive, the sort of quiet that made every little noise feel like it was magnified 1,000 times. "Hey, do you hear that?" Lisa asked, breaking the silence. She looked up from the stack of used plates she was drying. "Hear what?" I replied, trying to sound casual. But even I could hear an odd noise, like a low, rhythmic clanking coming from the basement. It was a sound I hadn't noticed before, making my skin crawl. "It's probably just the house settling," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. We had been in the basement earlier for the party prep, and nothing seemed out of place then. Trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me, we finished up and decided to call it a night. Lisa headed to bed, but I was again drawn to the basement. I told myself it was to check if the washing machine had stopped making that strange noise, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. As I descended the creaky stairs, the chill in the air became almost tangible. I flipped the switch for the basement light, but the bulb flickered on and off erratically before finally stabilizing. The basement looked different now, bathed in a harsh, flashing light. The shadows seemed longer, the corners darker. I walked over to the washing machine, which was now eerily quiet. The machine was still, but the sense of something being wrong didn't go away. It was as if the basement held its breath, waiting for something to happen. I checked the machine, but everything seemed normal. Just as I was about to head back upstairs, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from above. My heart pounded. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking around the upstairs floor, but no one else was in the house. I felt a cold draft against my neck, making me shiver. I turned around quickly, but the basement was empty. The smell of must and mildew was overpowering, mixing with an undercurrent of something else, something rank and decaying. I rushed back upstairs, my mind racing. I told Lisa about the noises and the strange feeling Id had. She looked at me with concern, but didn't seem as frightened as I felt. We decided to lock up and try to get some sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside made me jump. I kept imagining shadows moving just out of sight, and every time I thought I'd heard something, my heart would race. As I lay in bed, the unsettling feeling grew more assertive. I knew something wasn't right about this house, but I couldn't grasp it. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew the feeling was natural. The house had a history, and I was starting to think it wasn't the kind of history I wanted to be a part of. The party had been a success. Laughter and music had filled the house, and the eerie atmosphere I'd felt earlier seemed to dissipate for a while. But as the last guests left and the house fell silent, the unsettling feeling returned with a vengeance. My girlfriend, Emma, and I were cleaning up, trying to ignore the oddities that had started to plague our stay. The basement was now neatly stacked with extra tables, and we moved around the kitchen, putting away leftover food. That's when we heard a noise from the kitchen, like something was being knocked over. We exchanged nervous glances. "Probably just the house settling," Emma said reassuringly. But the sound was too deliberate, too precise to be mistaken for mere creaks and groans. We walked into the kitchen and froze. The old ceiling fan we had turned off hours earlier was now spinning at full speed. It whirred loudly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I walked over and reached to turn it off, but my hand stopped mid-air. The sensation was like stepping into a wall of ice. Emma looked at me, her face pale. Did you see that?" I nodded, ignoring the chill that had settled in my bones. I turned the fan off, but the unsettling feeling didn't dissipate. It felt like we were being watched, a sensation that grew stronger every second. "Let's check the basement," I suggested, hoping that if we could find a rational explanation, it would help dispel the creeping fear. We grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs. The basement, usually so benign, now felt oppressive. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, and every creak of the floorboards echoed unnervingly. I shone the light around, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The basement looked the same. Nothing had moved. Nothing was out of place. Yet the atmosphere was different. It felt as if something had shifted, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Emma touched the wall, her fingers tracing the old, crumbling plaster. "It's like the house is trying to tell us something," she said, trembling. We returned upstairs, our nerves frayed. As we settled into bed, the house seemed to be holding its breath. Every slight noise, every creak of the old wooden floor seemed magnified. I tried to sleep, but every shadow seemed to harbor something sinister, and every slight noise pulled me back into wakefulness. The night was restless. A new sound would jolt me awake whenever I thought I was drifting off. The sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoed in the distance. The sensation of cold fingers brushing against my skin kept me on edge. Emma clung to me, equally terrified, and we lay awake, listening to the whispers of the house as it revealed its dark side. By morning, I was exhausted. The sense of dread had not left us, and the noises from the night lingered in my mind. I knew we had to discover what was happening, but part of me was terrified of what we might uncover. The party went off without a hitch. My brother was surprised and thrilled to see so many friends and family gathered to celebrate his graduation. The house was filled with laughter and music, and for a few hours, I almost forgot about the eerie feeling I had when we first entered the basement. After the last guest left and the house fell silent, my girlfriend and I began to clean up. We moved through the dimly lit rooms, the atmosphere now heavy with a quiet that seemed almost oppressive. We decided to relax briefly before heading to bed, so we retreated to the living room to unwind. Then, I started to hear the faint sound of rattling from the kitchen. I brushed it off, attributing it to the old house settling or a draft moving through the rooms. But the noises persisted, growing louder and more insistent. "Did you hear that?" I asked my girlfriend, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. She nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, I thought I was imagining things." We made our way to the kitchen, the creak of the floorboards beneath our feet magnifying every sound. The room was as we had left, but the ceiling fan spun furiously high. I distinctly remembered turning it off earlier in the evening. I approached the fan, my hands trembling as I reached for the switch. "I'm sure I turned this off," I muttered, returning it to the off position. But even as the blades slowed to a stop, the unsettling feeling in my chest didn't dissipate. The sounds from earlier had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I checked the washing machine, which was making odd noises earlier. It was now silent and still, just as we had left it. There was no sign of malfunction or anything out of the ordinary. "Maybe it's just a draft," I suggested, though my words lacked conviction. The house was old, after all. There may be quirks we weren't aware of. We decided to head back to the living room, hoping the dread would pass. But as we settled onto the couch, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was still off. The air felt heavy, and every creak and groan of the old house seemed amplified in the darkness. Then I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. Shadows seemed to flicker and dance just beyond the edge of the light. I turned my head quickly but saw nothing. The feeling of being watched grew more robust, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. "I think we should just go to bed," I said, trying to sound casual. "Maybe we're just tired, and our imaginations are getting the best of us." My girlfriend agreed, though her eyes were wide with worry. As we made our way to the bedroom, I glanced back one last time at the kitchen, my heart pounding. I hoped that whatever was making those noises would stay out of our room for the rest of the night. After a restless night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with the old house. I knew I needed answers, so the next morning I decided to dig into Airbnb's history. It was clear that the strange occurrences weren't just random. They were connected to the house and perhaps something or someone from its past. I started with the internet. I scoured local history forums, checked property records, and read through articles about the area. Most of the information was mundane, articles about renovations and past tenants, but then I stumbled upon a local news archive from the 1980s. A brief mention caught my eye, a report about a man who had mysteriously disappeared from this neighborhood. His name was Richard Hayes, a man in his late 50s who had lived alone in a house that matched the description of my Airbnb. Intrigued, I made my way to the local library. I hoped there would be more information on Richard Hayes and his disappearance. The library was a quiet old building filled with the scent of aged paper. I approached the librarian, an older woman with kind eyes, and asked for any records or archives about Hayes. She directed me to a section filled with old newspapers and public records. I spent hours sifting through yellowed pages and faded clippings. The more I read, the more I realized how little had been its case. A Cordy had been resolved to the articles. He had been reported missing after neighbors saw his door left wide open. There were no signs of a struggle, and the police had found nothing but an empty house. The articles were filled with speculation but needed more concrete answers. One detail stood out, a mention of odd noises and strange sightings reported by neighbors just before Hayes vanished. The descriptions were unnervingly similar to what I had been experiencing. With this new information, I decided to talk to some locals who had lived in the area during Hayes' time. One woman, Mrs. Miller, remembered him vividly. She told me about the strange atmosphere surrounding Hayes' house and how people had whispered about hauntings and disappearances. She recalled that Hayes had been a recluse, rarely seen and often rumored to be involved in mysterious activities. Mrs. Miller's account gave me chills. She mentioned that after Hayes disappeared, the house had deteriorated for years before being sold. The more I learned, the more it seemed like the house had its dark history, a history that might explain the ghostly occurrences. I returned to the Airbnb feeling a mix of dread and determination. Understanding his story was crucial. If there was a link between Richard Hayes' disappearance and the disturbances, I had to keep digging. Still, I was starting to fear what I might uncover next. The nights grew longer, and the shadows more profound in that old house. After the party had ended, my girlfriend Lisa and I thought the unsettling experiences might result from an old house settling. Or maybe we were just letting our imaginations run wild. But the strangeness didn't decrease, it seemed to intensify. It began with subtle shifts in the house. At first, it was just the occasional creak from the old wooden floors, or the sound of the house settling, which we'd chalked up to age and natural wear. But then, Lisa started noticing things that couldn't be easily explained. The washing machine, which we hadn't used since the party, began making noises, gurgling and clanking sounds that resonated through the quiet of the night. The old fan in the living room, a relic from decades past, would turn on by itself, whirring to life even though we had ensured it was off before heading to bed. The night after these odd occurrences started, we decided to investigate. Lisa and I were lying in bed, the house eerily silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. As we were drifting off, a loud noise came from the kitchen. It was the sound of the fan, again, running at full speed, blowing air so forcefully that the sound was almost deafening. I glanced at Lisa, who looked as alarmed as I felt. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, already swinging my legs out of bed. "Let's check it out." I led the way, my flashlight casting long, shaky shadows on the walls. As we approached the kitchen, I heard the fan's high-pitched hum getting louder. I turned the corner and there it was, the fan, spinning wildly despite being turned off earlier. The light flickered above us, adding to the disorienting effect. Lisa and I hurried over to the fan, trying to turn it off. I reached up and flicked the switch, but it wouldn't stop. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, one I had always laughed at before but now seemed all too real. I disconnected the power, and the fan finally ceased its relentless spinning. "That's not right," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. I agreed. The sensation of being watched was now more palpable, hanging over us like a heavy fog. We tried to rationalize it and convinced ourselves that the fan was old and might have malfunctioned. We checked the washing machine, expecting to find simple issues like a loose connection or a malfunctioning part. To our surprise, it was utterly still, with no signs of any recent activity. But then came the whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder as the days went by. We would hear soft, indistinguishable murmurs during the night, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. They were always on the edge of hearing, as if someone was speaking to us from a distance we couldn't quite reach. One particularly chilling night, while we were both trying to ignore the growing dread, we heard a loud crash from the attic. I told Lisa to stay downstairs while I checked it out. Armed with nothing but my flashlight and a baseball bat, I climbed the narrow attic stairs, the creaking steps underfoot only adding to my anxiety. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten relics of a past era. I scanned the room, my flashlight darting over old trunks and faded photographs. The noise source became apparent when I spotted a large, heavy box that had fallen over. But what truly unsettled me were the old toys scattered around. Dolls with cracked faces and toys that seemed almost to be watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, and as I left the attic, I couldn't help but feel that something or someone was lurking in the shadows. The house's quiet was oppressive, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for the next unsettling event. That night, as I lay in bed, the whispers seemed to get louder, blending with the creaks and groans of the house. I found sleeping impossible. Every little noise made my heart race. The sense of being watched was relentless, and I began to wonder if we were not just dealing with an old house but with something far more sinister. I knew I had to try something different. The strange occurrences had reached a point where they were no longer just minor annoyances. They were terrifying. Every night brought new and more unsettling events. Objects moved on their own. The house seemed to whisper secrets in the dark. The shadowy presence felt almost tangible. It was clear that the house was haunted, and I was determined to find out why. After days of research and sleepless nights, I felt a mix of dread and determination. I needed to confront whatever haunted the old house if I wanted answers. I had read that ghosts might respond to attempts at communication, so I decided to reach out directly. One particularly dark and quiet night, I set up a small table in the living room, which had become the epicenter of the paranormal activity. I lit a few candles on the table, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the room. I arranged a small voice recorder in the center of the table, hoping it would capture any sounds or voices that might be present. With a deep breath, I began to speak. My voice wavered slightly, but I forced myself to remain calm. "If there's someone here, I want to understand what's happening. Please, if you can hear me, make your presence known." For a few moments, nothing happened. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I stayed focused. I know you're upset or restless. I'm just trying to help. Can you show me what happened? Tell me your story. The room remained still. The only sounds were the occasional crackling of the candles and the faint hum of the old house settling. I waited, hoping for any sign to confirm I wasn't alone. Then, just as I was about to give up, a sudden chill swept through the room. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting. The voice recorder picked up a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I rewound the tape and listened closely. The voice was barely audible, but it seemed to say, "Help me." The words sent a jolt of fear through me. Whoever or whatever was here was reaching out, and the plea for help was unmistakable. I felt a surge of empathy. The ghost wasn't just an evil presence, but a tormented soul seeking assistance. I continued, my voice steady despite the growing unease. "I heard you. I want to help. Can you tell me more about what happened? Why are you still here?" The temperature dropped even further, and a soft rustling sound filled the air like someone shifting restlessly. The candles flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I glanced around, my heart racing. Suddenly, the lights in the room dimmed and brightened sporadically, adding to the growing sense of urgency. I turned back to the recorder, trying to keep my composure. "Please let me know if you have a message or story. I'm here to listen." A series of loud knocks came from the walls, echoing through the room. They were rhythmic, almost like a Morse code. I couldn't make out any specific pattern, but it felt like the ghost was trying to communicate somehow. My pulse quickened, and I had to remind myself to stay calm. I realized that I needed to understand the house's history more thoroughly if I wanted to make any real progress. The ghost's response had been too vague, and I had to dig deeper into the past to discover why it was still trapped there. I spent the rest of the night researching old newspaper archives and local history, piecing together the fragments of the story the ghost seemed to hint at. The evidence was grim, a tale of a tragic disappearance and a series of unexplained deaths linked to the house. As the first light of dawn broke, I felt exhausted and hopeful. I had made contact with the spirit, and though the message was cryptic, it was clear that the ghost had been trying to communicate its suffering. I now had a more straightforward path to understanding what had happened and how I could help release the spirit from its torment. The real challenge lay ahead, deciphering the whole story and uncovering the truth hidden in the shadows of the old house. It was one of those sleepless nights where every sound seemed amplified and every shadow felt like it was watching me. After the latest disturbance, the fan inexplicably turning itself on again and the strange, almost mournful whispers in the dark, I decided enough was enough. I needed answers. By daylight, I was in full detective mode. I started with online research, diving into the house's history. I pored over local records, searching for anything related to its past. The house had been built in the early 1900s, a classic old structure with a few renovations over the decades. But the deeper I dug, the more I felt something was missing from the historical accounts. I visited the local library and spent hours flipping through old newspapers and local history books. My breakthrough came from a faded article in a dusty, old binder. It detailed a tragic event from about 50 years ago. A young woman named Margaret Holloway had disappeared without a trace. Margaret had lived in the house with her family before it became the Airbnb. The article described Margaret as a promising young woman who had mysteriously vanished one night. Her family was devastated, and despite extensive searches, she was never found. The article was filled with the usual speculation, foul play, abduction, or just a tragic accident. But something about her story resonated with the strange occurrences I had been experiencing. I scoured further and found a few more details about Margaret's case. Her family had been actively trying to find her, and there were mentions of strange things happening around the house even before her disappearance. The more I read, the more I realized there might be a connection between the ghostly occurrences and Margaret's story. The next step was to talk to the locals. I visited a small cafe that had been around since the 1950s, hoping to find someone who might remember Margaret or her family. I spoke with a few elderly patrons who were initially hesitant, but soon warmed up to me. One older man, Mr. Thompson, remembered the Holloways. He described them as a kind family, but mentioned that there were always rumors about odd happenings in the house. According to Mr. Thompson, there had been whispers of strange noises and flickering lights even before Margaret's disappearance. He recounted tales of neighbors who claimed to have seen ghostly figures or heard unsettling sounds from the house. Theo had a reputation long before it became an Airbnb. Armed with this information, I returned to the house with a new purpose. I began to piece together the clues: Margaret's disappearance, the unsettling noises, and the eerie presence I felt. It became clear that there was a link between the past and what was happening now. That night, I decided to confront the house's mysteries head-on. I set up a camera in the basement where I had first felt the cold dread. I also placed a recording device to capture sounds or voices that might reveal more about Margaret's fate. As the night wore on, I reviewed the footage and audio recordings. At first, there was an eerie silence, but then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. It was a woman's voice, repeating a name over and over. It sounded like Margaret. The voice was faint, but it was unmistakably there. I knew I had to dig deeper. The connection between Margaret's story and the strange events in the house was becoming more apparent. The whispers and sightings, the peculiar behavior of the appliances, pointed towards something unresolved from the past that was still lingering. By the end of the night, I felt I was on the brink of something significant. The pieces fell into place, but the whole picture was still out of reach. I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The night had settled into an oppressive silence, heavier than I had experienced since I started staying in the old Airbnb. My girlfriend, Lily, and I had retreated to the bedroom, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that had become a constant companion. We lay in the dim light of the bedside lamp, our conversation about the house's mysteries having dwindled to nervous whispers. Around 2 a.m., an eerie stillness enveloped the house. It was the same unsettling quiet that always preceded the disturbances. I had hoped that the ghostly apparitions would be nothing more than a figment of my imagination by now. But as I lay awake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Lily had fallen asleep, her steady breathing comforting in the otherwise tense atmosphere. I was about to close my eyes when I heard soft, deliberate footsteps moving down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The sound was too distinct, too rhythmic to be dismissed as anything but natural. I nudged Lily awake, but she only stirred slightly, mumbling incoherently before falling asleep. I decided to get up and investigate. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and crept into the hallway. The old wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, each step feeling like an intrusion into the house's dark secrets. The footsteps had stopped, but the cold air in the hallway was palpable. I made my way downstairs, each step deliberate, as I tried to ignore the creeping sensation of being watched. The house was dark, the only light source coming from the flickering street lamps outside. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something unusual. The living room, which had been tidy before, now had items scattered as if someone had rummaged through them in a hurry. My pulse quickened. I approached the kitchen, where the sounds had originated from the previous nights. As I turned the corner into the kitchen, I froze. In the middle of the room stood the shadowy figure I had seen before. It was no longer a fleeting glimpse, but a solid, dark shape. The figure seemed to pulse almost palpably, its form vaguely humanoid but distorted and shifting. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence growing more vital, more defined. I had seen enough in my research to recognize the apparition linked to the house's tragic past. The figure seemed to be waiting for me to say something, to make a move. I gathered my courage and spoke, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay steady. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure remained silent, but a sudden rush of cold air filled the room, making me shiver. The temperature drop was so intense that my breath became visible, swirling in the dim light. The shadow seemed to flicker, and I could make out what looked like old-fashioned clothes, something that matched the description of the missing resident I had read about. Desperate for answers, I took a tentative step forward. "I know about what happened here. I want to help. Please, tell me what you need." The figure remained still, but I noticed a faint glow from its center. The light brightened gradually, revealing a tattered paper that seemed to float before the apparition. It looked like an old document, possibly a letter or a journal entry. I reached out slowly, trembling, and took the floating paper. The moment my fingers touched it, the figure dissolved into a swirl of shadows, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The paper was worn and faded, but I could make out a few words written in a spidery hand. "Help me. Find the truth." The house seemed to exhale a sigh of relief, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. I knew that whatever had haunted this place, or caused the strange occurrences, had left a final clue for me to uncover. I returned to the bedroom, clutching the paper tightly. Lily was still asleep, oblivious to the events unfolding downstairs. I hoped that this document would lead me to the final pieces of the puzzle and bring some closure to the restless spirit that had plagued us. The mystery wasn't over yet, but I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since my arrival. The ghost had given me a chance to resolve its unfinished business, and I was determined to see it through. The old house was quieter than it had ever been. The oppressive silence that had settled over it since the strange occurrences began seemed heavier tonight. I'd spent days trying to piece together the fragments of history and the unsettling experiences that had plagued us. My girlfriend Jess and I had faced so many inexplicable events, phantom noises, eerie cold spots, and that disturbing discovery of the ceiling fan running at full blast. Each night I had hoped to find answers, but nothing prepared me for the encounter we were about to have. It was just past midnight when the atmosphere in the house shifted. I was lying on the couch in the living room. Jess was in the kitchen when the air grew dense and heavy, almost suffocating. I felt a familiar shiver run down my spine. The house had gone silent, a deadening quiet that seemed almost unnatural. The lights flickered, and the old fan we had turned off earlier whirred back to life, its blades slicing through the stillness with an eerie hum. "Did you hear that?" Jess's voice trembled as she emerged from the kitchen. Her face was pale in the dim light, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. "I did," I replied, my heart racing. "I think we should recheck the basement." The basement had been the epicenter of our unease, and despite everything, I felt drawn to it. I grabbed a flashlight and motioned for Jess to follow. We descended the creaky wooden stairs, the familiar scent of old must and mildew growing stronger with each step. The basement was dimly lit by a single bare bulb that swayed slightly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight flickered, and I heard it. A low, mournful whisper that seemed to float through the air, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. Jess grabbed my arm, her grip tight and cold. "I'm scared," she whispered. I nodded, trying to remain calm. "Let's find out what's going on." We moved carefully through the basement, my flashlight sweeping across the cluttered space. The old furniture and dusty boxes looked the same, but something felt different, more oppressive. I shone the light towards the corner where the old table we had used during the party was stored. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, flickered in and out of existence near the table. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, an amorphous shape, seemingly made of the same darkness surrounding us. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and as I moved closer, it solidified into a form, a spectral figure in old-fashioned clothing, its eyes hollow and empty. Jess gasped beside me, clutching my arm tighter. "What is that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it looks like it's trying to communicate." The figure seemed to notice us, its empty gaze focusing on us. It raised an arm, pointing towards a dusty old trunk in the far corner of the basement. I had overlooked the trunk in my earlier searches, but something compelled me to investigate it now. With a mixture of dread and determination, I approached the trunk and opened it. Inside, we found old letters, photographs, and a small journal. The journal belonged to a woman named Eleanor, a former resident of the house who had mysteriously disappeared decades ago. The entries spoke of her fear of being watched, strange noises, and a growing dread. One entry was particularly chilling. It mentioned a shadowy figure that had begun to appear in the house, which she believed was responsible for her impending disappearance. As I read through the journal, I could feel the temperature in the basement drop even further. The shadowy figure seemed to be reacting to the journal's contents, its form becoming more defined and its movements more agitated. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, clearer. "Help me! Find the truth!" The figure's voice echoed around us, a ghostly plea for assistance. I looked at Jess, who was visibly shaken, but nodded in understanding. We had uncovered part of the story, but more was still to be revealed. "We need to find out what happened to Eleanor," I said, determination setting in. "We need to finish what she started." The ghostly figure seemed to acknowledge this, its form flickering with what I could only interpret as relief. With the journal in hand, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. We would uncover the entire story behind Eleanor's disappearance, hoping that by doing so, we could put the restless spirit to peace and finally bring closure to the old house.